I never believed in perfection. I always thought that life, no matter how calculated, had cracks, spaces where the truth could seep through. That's what made me pursue a career in the police. The belief that every crime leaves clues, that nothing can happen without someone, sooner or later, finding out. But of course, not everything in this world is governed by logic, and what happened to me years ago changed the way I see things. And worst of all, what hurt me the most wasn't the crime itself, but the way he fooled us all. A long time ago, almost a decade ago, I was assigned a case that seemed as simple as any other. A murder in the city center, in one of those dark streets that empty of life when night falls. The victim was an ordinary man, a man of no importance to most people, but with a story that no one was interested in discovering. At first, the case seemed like just another one of those crimes of passion that never cease to occur in big cities. The body of a man found in his apartment with no obvious signs of a struggle. His death seemed almost accidental, or at least that's what I wanted to believe at first. Everything seemed too clean, too calculated. The first time I saw the crime scene, I felt a void, as if something didn't fit. There were a couple of strange details, to be sure. The body was on the floor, naked, but not in a violent position. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains outside of what one would expect from a murder. The few traces left by the forensic team revealed nothing that would give us any concrete clues. However, there was something that bothered me. A small piece of torn fabric, a fragment of what appeared to be a jacket. It seemed insignificant, but something in my gut told me that this piece of fabric could be crucial. Over the next few days, the investigation stalled. No one knew anything about the victim. He appeared to be an ordinary man, with no enemies and no close relatives. An isolated being almost invisible to the world. The few friends who came forward knew nothing that could help. The case began to lose relevance, as so many others do, and it was filed away with the label, Unsolved Murder. Months passed, and although my life went on, the case never completely disappeared from my mind. I felt that there was something there, something that was slipping away from us. I became obsessed with the crime, revisiting the evidence every so often, looking for something we hadn't considered before. But it was useless. The torn fabric, which didn't fit with anything known, became a mere reminder of what we didn't know. Until one day, almost a year later, something changed. I received a call. It wasn't about the case itself, but about a person who had been arrested in a nearby town, a man who, according to the report, was behaving strangely. The arrest was for attempted fraud, but the local police had linked him, in some way, to the murder we had investigated. There was nothing at that point to suggest that this could be relevant, but my instinct told me I had to go and see him. And so I did. When I arrived, the man was in a cell, calm, almost too calm. I was asked to talk to him, to try to get some information out of him. It wasn't easy. Despite his apparent nervousness, something in his eyes told me he wasn't willing to reveal anything. However, it wasn't his indifference that surprised me. It was the fact that, as I watched him closely, something about the way he moved, his gestures, reminded me of someone. Someone I had seen at the crime scene years earlier, although I had no proof of it. A feeling of unease grew inside me. Over time, I managed to connect him to the murder, and discovered that although he was not directly involved in the crime, he had been in the city at the time of the death. It turned out that the man had witnessed something, but never mentioned it. Somehow, he felt guilty, even though he had no direct responsibility. What he discovered, however, left me stunned. The man who had committed the crime, the killer who had eluded us all this time, was an ordinary individual. At first, I didn't associate him with anything extraordinary. He wasn't a professional criminal, nor did he have a history of violence. He was, in fact, a man with a seemingly normal life. But the pieces began to fall into place when one of the victim's friends, who had come forward as a witness, finally gave me a clue that no one had noticed before. At first, I thought he was mistaken, but when I checked it out, the truth hit me like a punch in the gut. It turned out that the torn jacket, the one that seemed so irrelevant, belonged to someone very close to the victim. That fabric was from a coat that had been lent by the killer who, it seemed, knew the victim very well. No one suspected him because he was someone who always stayed in the shadows, someone who didn't stand out, someone with a completely normal appearance. At first, we didn't understand the connection between them, but little by little the puzzle began to take shape. This man had been the victim's co-worker for years. In fact, he had been a close friend at first, but things between them had slowly deteriorated. There were no big fights or open disputes, but something in the relationship changed over time. The killer began to feel displaced, insecure. The victim, with his stable life and seemingly brilliant career, became a constant source of frustration for him. What appeared to be a murder without motive turned out to be a hidden vendetta, a story of resentment that had been brewing for years. The murder, according to subsequent reports, was carried out with chilling precision. The man knew exactly what to do to avoid getting caught. He left no traces, there were no witnesses, and he manipulated the crime scene with such care that it was almost impossible to find a clue linking him directly to the victim. He used his knowledge of the victim's daily life to disappear without a trace. His behavior afterward was cold and calculating. He never showed any signs of guilt or nervousness. What surprised me most was how he had managed to stay off the radar for so long. In a world full of details, he had learned to disappear, to become invisible, to become a shadow in a society that quickly forgets. No one suspected anything because he simply wasn't someone anyone could remember. When we finally caught him, he was in a place we never imagined, working in a small shop in a remote neighborhood. He had continued his life, living among us as if nothing had happened. No one recognized him, not even those who had shared years with him. At first, when we confronted him, he seemed confused. Not because he didn't know what he had done, but because, in his mind, the crime had never caught up with him. I never fully understood how someone could carry such a heavy burden for so long without the world noticing. Maybe it was fear that drove him, or maybe he just didn't care. But what became clear to me is that, in this world, the perfect crime isn't the one that isn't committed, but the one that is forgotten. And no matter how hard we try to keep searching for the truth, there are those who manage to evade it. For him, justice never came in time. And for me, the case never ceased to be a shadow, a reminder that sometimes perfection isn't what it seems. I remember the first time I heard about the disappearance. I was sitting in a room full of maps and files, one of those gray days when the sun hides behind the clouds and rain threatens to fall at any moment. I'd had a routine day at work, but something in the air told me that something different was going to happen that night. Maybe it was the way the story was told to me, or the way my instincts reacted to the information. But the truth is that this disappearance, which at first seemed like just another case, ended up becoming an obsession for me. I was assigned to a special unit that investigated disappearances in national parks. Over the years, a large number of reports had accumulated about people who had disappeared strangely while traveling through the vast territories of forests, mountains, and canyons. At first, like many others, I thought they were isolated cases. Reckless hikers, people who had gotten lost or had accidents. But over time, as I read the reports, I began to see a pattern that sent a chill down my spine. The first thing that caught my attention was the contradictory details in many of the cases. Some said that people had disappeared without a trace. Others said that their belongings were found in strange places as if they had been abandoned suddenly. Some bodies turned up months or even years later in places no one could explain. The official versions always tried to downplay the matter, talking about accidents or the negligence of the missing persons. But there was something else. Something that couldn't be so easily explained by chance. My first important case was that of a young man who had gone on a solo trip to the national park. At first, everything seemed normal. He registered, signed the entry form, and began his hike along a popular trail. However, a few hours later, someone who saw him pass by said that something strange had happened. The young man, who normally carried a light backpack and seemed experienced in outdoor activities, appeared somewhat disturbed. He wasn't alone, but he didn't seem to be interacting with anyone else. It wasn't long before he disappeared without a trace. What worried me about this case was the complete lack of evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no traces of blood. Local authorities combed the area, used tracking dogs, and retraced the routes he should have taken, but they found absolutely nothing. The young man had disappeared in the most mysterious way possible, without leaving a trace, without showing any signs of having encountered anything that could have caused him to disappear. My initial investigation led me to review the records of other disappearances in the park. That's when I came across an anomaly, Over the past 30 years, several hikers and tourists had disappeared in areas very close to the same route, in some cases under similar circumstances. However, the authorities had never linked the cases, as there was no hard evidence to justify it. Official reports always referred to accidents or unsolved disappearances, and most of the time and oblivion took care of burying the mystery. What I couldn't understand was why the disappearances always occurred in the same areas and under such similar circumstances. It wasn't a particularly dangerous or inaccessible place. There were no clear signs of wild animals in the area, and the weather conditions weren't extreme at the time most people disappeared. The most common explanation I was given was that people simply got lost or had accidents. But something told me there was more to it. As the days passed, my investigation deepened, and I began to uncover theories that left me uneasy. The most intriguing one spoke of a phenomenon known as dead spots. According to some people who had been working in the park for years, there were certain areas where, inexplicably, all traces of people disappeared. Not just footprints, but also electronic signals, such as those from cell phones or GPS devices. Some said that the affected areas seemed to have a kind of distortion field, although no one could provide a scientific explanation. But the most disturbing theory I came across was the one that spoke of the existence of a natural wolf's mouth. According to some accounts, the park was located above a series of extensive underground caverns. These caverns were said to somehow create a magnetic phenomenon that disrupted compasses and navigation systems, causing people to become disoriented and trapped in a space they could never escape. But the most disturbing aspect of this theory was not just the idea of getting lost, but the possibility that some people simply could not return. According to certain experts in geography and archaeology, the caves were not only inaccessible but also dangerous, full of deep crevices and areas that collapsed without warning. What baffled me most was the lack of solid evidence. Official reports, rescue team searches, interviews with witnesses, everything seemed to be a maze of contradictions. People disappeared, but the investigations never reached a conclusion. Every time we thought we had found a lead, it fell apart in our hands, and the disappearances continued. One night, while reviewing the file on another recent case, I came across a detail that made me stop in my tracks. The disappearance had not been in the most remote park, or in an area difficult to access. No, this time it happened near a popular campsite, right in one of the areas considered safe for tourists. The missing person was a middle-aged man traveling with his family. He had gone out for a walk in the morning, as he often did, and never returned. The tracks he left behind were followed for a couple of kilometers, but then they simply disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, an accident, or anything out of the ordinary. Local authorities searched actively, but in the end, their efforts were in vain. What caught my attention about this case was not so much the disappearance itself, but the reaction of the rescue team. During the search, one of the tracking dogs became excessively nervous near a small stream. This behavior was unusual, as the dogs were usually very effective at their job. Experts said the dog was sensing something in the air, but no one could determine what. No one, except me. While analyzing the recordings from nearby security cameras, I found something that made my blood run cold. Just before the man disappeared, the camera captured a strange distortion in the air, as if something invisible had altered the environment. The image wasn't clear, but the feeling was unmistakable. As if the air itself had become dense, as if a vortex of some kind had appeared and sucked everything around it in. I didn't know what to think. The idea of a magnetic field or some natural anomaly began to seem more plausible, but scientific explanations remained vague and without tangible evidence. And even stranger was the fact that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Other hikers who had been in the same area in previous years reported strange sensations: nausea, vertigo, and the feeling of being watched. As the days passed, I began to wonder if there really was a rational answer to all this, or if there was something much darker at play. As I investigated further, more people began to come forward with stories about the park. The testimonies varied, but they all seemed to share a common feeling: something was not right. Those who had been lucky enough to leave the area, though often with no clear memories of what had happened, spoke of a strange sense of disorientation, as if time and space had blurred together. Some people mentioned hearing their own names whispered in the wind, and others spoke of the feeling that something or someone was watching them. Somehow I couldn't help but feel that all these cases were connected in some way. Something in that park, something that couldn't be explained, was taking people. And worst of all, no one could say for sure what was really going on. The missing people remained a mystery, but deep down, part of me knew that the answers would never be found. In the end, not everything in this world has a clear explanation, and there are places where logic and reason are useless. Sometimes the park takes its visitors and they leave nothing behind. I couldn't help but wonder how many more had been lost without us ever knowing. I never knew how to deal with it. It's strange how you get used to routines, to everyday life, to the little complications of daily life. But then suddenly something changes, something breaks in the air, and everything that seemed solid crumbles. One day you wake up and realize that life will never be the same, that a piece of you is gone forever. That's what happened when I lost my daughter, when she disappeared from my life in a heartbeat, and all because of something I couldn't see coming. It was a warm spring afternoon. The air had that softness that accompanies the last days of the season, just before the summer heat takes over. I was sitting in the living room watching the news when I heard the familiar sound of my daughter's footsteps running through the house. She was always running or jumping from one place to another. She had recently turned 15, and although I was a little concerned about how she had changed, I saw it as something normal. It was the stage when she was beginning to shape herself, to define her identity. But that afternoon, the sound of her footsteps wasn't like all the others. I can't explain it well, but there was something about the way she walked that put me on alert. It was as if I knew something wasn't right, as if there was a silence around her that I couldn't perceive. When she entered the living room, I saw her absorbed in her cell phone, her head down, her eyes fixed on the screen. It wasn't unusual. She did it all the time, and although I wasn't a big fan of technology, I let her be. It was part of her life, her world. Sometimes I asked her not to spend so much time on her phone, to interact more with the real world, but I didn't insist too much. Like any parent, I trusted that everything would work itself out, that this phase would pass. But that afternoon, everything changed. What happened next was like a nightmare, one that haunts me even now, so long after it happened. My daughter was quiet, but her face reflected a sadness I didn't understand. I knew something was bothering her, but at first I thought it was just teenage stuff. Those little dramas you let slide because there doesn't seem to be any real danger behind them. And then one afternoon I discovered what was going on. It wasn't a big discovery or a revealing moment. It was something small, almost accidental. While I was in the kitchen, her phone rang on the table. It wasn't the first time she had left it there without paying attention to it, but this time something made me stop. I didn't see her, but I knew she was nearby. I could hear her in her room, maybe crying, maybe thinking. Something inside me compelled me to look at the phone. It wasn't my intention. It wasn't like me, but the feeling I had wouldn't leave me alone. I picked it up, and that's when I saw it. Messages. Just a few, but enough to understand everything. I couldn't help reading them. My mind couldn't stop searching for answers. They were cruel, malicious, like knives thrown in her direction. They despised the way she was, the way she dressed, her opinions. There were insults, threats, and taunts. The messages came from people she knew, from her classmates, from those with whom she had shared laughter and secrets for years, people who were supposed to be her friends. That was the worst part of all. They weren't strangers. They weren't anonymous bullies. They were the same boys and girls she saw every day at school, who shared the same hallways, the same teachers. Those who, like her, were also part of her world. Reading those messages froze me inside. There were insults about her appearance, her weight, her tastes, her personality. There was nothing in her life that wasn't attacked. I stood there, phone in hand, completely stunned, not knowing what to do. I didn't know whether to call someone, confront her, or report it. I felt powerless, as if the air itself were slipping through my fingers. It was too late to react. When I finally decided to talk to her, it was already too late. The sun had begun to set and the house was enveloped in growing darkness when I found her. Her bedroom door was closed, something that didn't usually happen because she always left the door ajar, as if she needed life to flow towards her. I entered quietly, hoping that maybe I could find a way to help her, to make her feel that she wasn't alone. But what I saw destroyed me. My daughter was standing there next to her desk looking at something on her computer. At first I thought she was just watching a video or surfing the internet, like she had done so many times before, but when I got closer, I saw that the screen was displaying a message. One more message, one that I couldn't read completely but that I understood in that instant. It was the last straw, the final attack, the last taunt. That message told her she was worthless, that her life had no purpose, that she would be better off dead. It was a message like so many others, but apparently, that was the one that broke her. That was the one that pushed her over the edge. I found her too late. I couldn't save her. At that moment, I felt completely powerless. I clutched the phone tightly, as if that could turn back time, as if I could reverse what had just happened. But I couldn't. There was no going back. My daughter's life, the life she had been building, had vanished like a breath, like a shadow slipping through my fingers. In that moment, I knew that everything that had been my life had changed forever. My daughter was no longer there, and worst of all, there was nothing I could do to bring her back. The hours that followed were a whirlwind. The doctors, the police, the people who came to the house. People trying to understand what had happened, searching for answers they couldn't find. No one understood what was really happening, and they all looked at me as if they expected me to have the answer, as if I could give them a logical reason. But I couldn't. There was no logical reason. There was only pain, a grief that tore me apart inside, and guilt. That guilt that wouldn't let me breathe, that suffocated me every time I thought about what had happened. When the police began their investigation, I discovered that my daughter had been suffering in silence for months. Those messages, those constant attacks, had been only part of her nightmare. She had received threats, taunts, insults, all from people who were supposed to be her friends. No one noticed that she was falling apart inside. No one paid attention to her. And I, as her father, had been so blind, so incapable of seeing the suffering she was carrying, that I too became part of that neglect. Sometimes I wondered if anything I did could have changed the course of events. If a conversation, a hug at the right moment, would have been enough to save her. Weeks passed, months passed, but the guilt never went away. I started to see everything differently. The world, society, the way people interact. Everything seemed darker, colder, as if my daughter's suffering had left a scar in the very air. I found myself watching other children on the street, in schools, wondering if they were going through the same thing, if someone else was being silently torn apart by the same words, by the same invisible attacks. The worst part is that in the end life went on, as it always does. People went about their routines, their lives. Some looked at me with pity, others didn't know what to say. The messages that destroyed my daughter were left behind, forgotten by everyone, while she, my daughter, was no longer there to defend herself, to continue growing, to live. The truth is that after everything that happened, I was never the same again. Sadness and guilt follow me everywhere. And even though life goes on, even though time passes and things change, there is a void that cannot be filled, a wound that never heals. And worst of all, even if I wanted to, I will never know if my daughter really believed the words of those digital monsters or if she simply let herself be swept away by pain and despair. All I know is that when I looked at her face for the last time, I no longer saw the girl I knew. I saw someone completely different, someone who was no longer there. All I have left is emptiness, the memory of what could have been, the anguish of not having arrived in time to save her. And that feeling, that time, in its cruel indifference, has no mercy on those left behind.